Today on Historical Moments we're tackling one of history's most famous voyages, Christopher Columbus sailing the ocean blue in 1492. But here's the thing, Columbus wasn't trying to discover America. He had no idea it existed. So why did he set sail? And what was he actually looking for? Let's dive into the real story behind one of history's most consequential accidents. To understand Columbus's journey we need to talk about spices. In 15th century Europe, spices like pepper, cinnamon, cloves and nutmeg were worth their weight in gold, sometimes literally. These spices came from Asia, particularly India and the Indonesian islands, and they were essential. They preserved food, masked the taste of meat that was going off, and were used in medicine. They were status symbols. The problem, getting them to Europe was incredibly expensive. The traditional route went overland through the Middle East and Central Asia, or by sea around the Arabian Peninsula. At every stop along the way, middlemen took their cut. By the time spices reached European markets, prices had skyrocketed. The Ottoman Empire had also been expanding, making these eastern trade routes even more difficult and costly. European kingdoms were desperate to find a way to cut out the middlemen and get direct access to Asian spices. Portugal had been working on sailing around Africa to reach Asia, and they were making progress, but that route was long and dangerous. This is where Columbus comes in, with what he thought was a brilliant idea. Christopher Columbus was a skilled Italian sailor from Genoa who had been working for years as a merchant mariner. He'd studied geography and read the available texts and came up with the plan. What if you could reach Asia by sailing west across the Atlantic instead of east around Africa? Now let's clear up a common myth right away. Educated people in 1492 absolutely knew the earth was round. This wasn't controversial. The ancient Greeks had figured this out nearly 2,000 years earlier. The question wasn't about the Earth's shape, it was about the distance. Here's where Columbus made his crucial error. He'd read Marco Polo's accounts of Asia and various geographical texts, and he calculated that Asia was only about 3,000 miles west of Europe. In reality it's more like 12,000 miles, and there's a whole other continent in the way that Europeans don't know about. Most educated people at the time actually disagreed with Columbus's calculations. They thought Asia was much further away, and they were right. But Columbus was convinced he was correct, and more importantly, he was determined to find a sponsor who would fund his expedition. Columbus first tried to sell his idea to King John II of Portugal in 1484. Portugal had the best sailors and navigators in Europe at the time, but the Portuguese Royal Commission of Mathematicians and Navigators rejected his proposal. They correctly calculated that Asia was much further than Columbus claimed, making the journey impossible with the ships and supplies of the day. Columbus didn't give up. He tried pitching to the Spanish monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella, but they were busy with the final stages of the Reconquista, a campaign to drive the Moors out of the Iberian Peninsula. They told him to come back later. He approached England and France, no dice. He went back to Spain and tried again in 1488. Still nothing. Finally, in 1492, after Granada, the last Moorish kingdom in Spain, fell. Ferdinand and Isabella had the time and resources to reconsider. They'd just completed a centuries-long campaign and were feeling pretty good about themselves. Plus, Portugal was making gains in the race to reach Asia by sailing around Africa. Spain was at a risk of being left behind. The monarchs still had their doubts, but the deal Columbus offered was attractive. He'd fund most of the voyage through private investors. They'd get a massive return on their investment if he succeeded, and Spain would gain a trade advantage over Portugal. After lengthy negotiations where Columbus demanded titles and percentage of profits, they agreed. So let's be clear about Columbus's goals. He was looking for, first and foremost, a western sea route to Asia. Specifically, he wanted to reach China, Japan, and the Spice Islands. He thought he'd land in Japan after crossing the Atlantic. The economic motivation was huge. Columbus had negotiated to keep 10% of all riches found, plus government of any lands discovered. This wasn't altruistic exploration, it was business. Columbus demanded to be named Admiral of the Ocean Sea, and governor of any lands he encountered. For a man of relatively modest birth, these were extraordinary social advancements. Columbus and the Spanish monarchs also framed the voyage in religious terms, spreading Christianity and potentially funding a crusade to reclaim Jerusalem, with the wealth they'd find. This was the late medieval period, and religious justification for exploration was standard. What he absolutely was not looking for was a new world, or a continent unknown to Europeans. That possibility wasn't even on his radar. Columbus set sail on August 3rd, 1492 with 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta and the Santa Maria. After stopping in the Canary Islands, they headed west into the unknown on September 6th. The crew grew increasingly nervous as weeks passed with no land in sight. Columbus had to convince them to keep going, allegedly even keeping 2 sets of logs, one showing the real distance travelled and one showing less to keep the crew from panicking. On October 12 they spotted land, an island in what we now call the Bahamas. Columbus thought he'd reached the islands off the coast of Asia. He called the indigenous people he met Indians because he believed he was in the Indies. He spent the next few months island hopping through the Caribbean, searching for the gold and spices he expected to find in Asia. He found some gold, but not the massive quantities he'd promised. He found no spices, and the geography didn't match Marco Polo's descriptions at all. But Columbus maintained until his death that he'd reached Asia. He made 3 more voyages exploring most of the Caribbean and the coast of Central and South America, still insisting he'd found a route to the East Indies. Other explorers soon realised what Columbus hadn't. This was an entirely different landmass. Amerigo Vespucci figured it out, which is why the continents eventually got named America, after him, not Columbia, after Christopher. Ironically, Columbus's miscalculation, which everybody else got right, led to one of history's most significant encounters. His voyage connected 2 hemispheres that had been separated for thousands of years, triggering enormous changes for everyone involved. Spain did get its empire and its gold, just not from Asia. Portugal eventually did find their sea route to Asia by sailing around Africa, which is what the experts said would work all along. But Spain got the Americas, which turned out to be pretty valuable too. So why did Columbus sail? He wanted to get rich by finding a shortcut to Asian spices. He wanted glory and noble titles. He wanted to prove the experts wrong about his calculations, even though they were right and he was wrong. Sometimes in history, being wrong at the right time can change the world more than being right. Thanks for listening, everybody. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe and like the video, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.